Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and for today's cards I decided to do some very easy coloring, as in anyone can do it. You don't need any special skills, super simple. So what I did was I started with some distress watercolor paper, and I have the smooth side facing up, and I have Honeybee's Spring Blossoms stamp set here. And for this piece I'm using all of the floral images in that set. And I am going to heat emboss them onto this watercolor paper. So I use my anti-static powder tool first, and then I'm just using Ink on 3's Juicy Embossing Ink. Any embossing ink will work. And then I'm going to use Hero Art's White Satin Pearl embossing powder. Any embossing powder would work for this. I'm kind of obsessed with this right now because it's pretty. So I'm going to stamp these images onto that watercolor paper, and then I'm going to emboss them. Then off camera, I ended up embossing a second panel with this since I had it all lined up. And then I also did the leaves. And then I also used the Chin Up Buttercup set, and I'll get to that in a minute. So once I've got everything stamped, I coated it with the embossing powder, and then I'm going to melt it with my heat tool until it is all smooth and shiny and melted. And the camera definitely doesn't do this embossing powder justice at all. It's got just such a nice soft shimmer to it. Nothing too crazy. So for the actual coloring of this, I am going to use my Wendy Vecchi Make Art dye inks, and these inks are they work really well with water. They're not the same as distress inks, like it's not the same formula, but distress ink would also work. Distress oxide ink would work. Any ink that moves really well with water works for this, which these inks do, and they're really pretty, and I've had them sitting here, so I wanted to make a point of using them. And all I'm doing is just applying ink to paper. You don't need to have blending skills, because I know that's something a lot of people struggle with. I do at times too, you know, getting that nice perfect blend. Don't need to worry about that. Just get the ink on. If you really want to, you could just take the ink pads like direct to paper. But for this, I'm just using my Ranger ink blending tools. I even used a mini blending tool and applied a little bit of the Acorn Brown ink to the center. And then I'm just spraying it with water. That's it. That's literally all you do. It's so simple. If you really wanted to get a little fancier, you could also add a bit of shimmer, you know, mix some perfect pearl powders with water and spray that. Anything will work. So I did that with the purple panels with the spring blossoms. For the leaves, again, super simple. I'm just using 2 shades of green, and my blends, you don't need to make them perfect. You just need to get the color on, because any like harsh lines, anything like that, those are going to be eradicated when you spray the water on. So all you really need to do is just get the color onto the cardstock. So I'm using 2 shades of the green Make Art inks. I'm using Prickly Pear and Fern Green, and just literally slapping the color on, not worrying about it. And then I'm going to spray this liberally with water and then set it aside to dry. So these inks are interesting when water is applied, and you'll get different results depending on, you know, what type of dye ink you're using. Like I said, distress ink would work really well. Distress oxide would also work really well. You'd get some interesting effects with either of those. So I did those ones, and then the Chin Up Buttercup set, I purposely stamped all of these, and I also heat embossed them, and I stamped them so that the blooms were kind of at the top of this piece, and then all the greenery in the leaves are at the bottom parts of the piece, just to make it a little easier to add the ink. So I added sunflower dye ink to the blooms, and then everything else I used those same 2 greens, just slapping color on. Not worrying about it. Especially with these, it's not a concern, because if the green and the yellow mix together at all, green and yellow, it'll just make a different shade of green, basically. So I just got all that color on, and then same thing, sprayed it super heavy with water, set it aside to dry. No skills, no effort, nothing, and fun. Like, you could experiment with different color combinations of inks to see what would happen. Like I said, you could add shimmer, all kinds of things. So once I got all of that color on there, I sprayed it. If you really wanted to, you could go back and after everything's dry, you want to make sure it's dry. You could add more ink and spray it again to, you know, intensify colors. It just depends. Sky's the limit. So I only did the 1 layer of ink, sprayed it, let it all dry, and after it's dry, it still kind of looks like a hot mess because you got ink going everywhere. But I'm going to cut all of these out with the coordinating Honey Cuts dies. So I'm going to tape all of these dies into place. And then I'm going to run them through my die cut machine. And since I was doing like doubles of everything, it was a fair bit of die cutting. But I got several cards out of one sitting doing all of this. So I've got everything die cut. And then for my card front panels, I die cut some gray cardstock with the second largest DECKLE edge wafer die. I just like that nice, like it's like a perfectly torn edge is kind of how it looks. So I die cut those with that. And then I pulled out this honeybee stencil and I'm just lightly blending over some of the watering can Wendy Vecchi ink over that, just to give it that fun little bit of texture. So just picking up the ink with the mini ink blending tool. Those blending brushes I always like to use, those would work great as well. Either whatever tools you have. This is kind of a very simple way to apply ink with both techniques, like this with tone on tone, as well as what I did earlier. So I did that for my backgrounds. And then for the 2 cards with the spring blossoms, I used some black cardstock. I ran it through my little Xyron. This is the 3-inch sticker maker here. So now all of these pieces of cardstock have adhesive on the back of them. And then I'm going to die cut these with Honeybee's Thinking of You wafer die. So I've got adhesive on the back of these. And then I just trimmed off the excess backing paper because then I could run these through my Sidekick since I was doing a whole bunch of die cutting with these as well. So it just made things go a lot faster. So I'm going to die cut these layers and they're all going to have adhesive on the back, which makes things a lot simpler to stack these together. So I don't have to fiddle with liquid adhesive or just anything. I can just peel off the backing, stick these together and get the depth I want. So I have 3 layers for these die cuts. And I leave my first layer just in the cardstock. It's just more convenient this way. And then I can just peel off all the other layers of the die cut letters and adhere them right on top. So it doesn't take very long. My little die pick works wonders for something like this to peel off the backing. It also works really well for placing really small items and things like that. So the Tim Holtz paper piercer type unit as well is very similar to this, like either a die pick or the Tim Holtz one that's retractable. That works really well too. I love these. I use them almost every single time I craft. So I'm going to layer all of these together until I have the 3 layers. And then once I've got the 3 layers, I can then pop this out of the like scrap cardstock and adhere it to my background. And again, the nice thing about this is this adhesive gives me like complete wiggle room. Like I can move things around, like as I'll lay it right on my background and you can move it around, do whatever you want. It's not until you really press down firmly that things are adhered into place. So that's another reason I love it, because I'm not having to, move really quickly with liquid adhesive and getting things in the wrong spot or anything like that. Like I have wiggle room. I like that. I need that most of the time because I'm just flying by the seat of my pants, like figuring out what I'm doing. So adhered everything into place. I showed there using my die pick to adhere the tittles to the eye. Still think of Laura Basson every single time I say that. So anywho, adhered all of that into place. And then I'm going to start adhering all these spring blossoms. You could technically get like multiple cards. You don't need to use like all of them in one card, but I couldn't help myself. I love that like big cluster of all the purple flowers. I thought it looked so pretty. So I adhered all of them from the set onto one card, but since I'd done it twice, I get 2 cards of each. I only show making of 1 of each on here because it's redundant. But yeah, you could end up getting multiples if you didn't, need to use every single flower and leaf and all that. You could just use a few on each one. But I clustered them all around on this panel here, just using foam tape to pop everything up and give it dimension. So I was either using foam tape or I'd also use a little bit of craft tacky glue just to get everything adhered. And then for the chin up buttercup flowers, same thing, kind of got them lined up, their little cluster, adhered the leaves and whatnot. And then for that one, for the sentiment, I used the large buttercup stamp from the set, and I'm just stamping this onto a scrap of vellum. I'm going to stamp it with that same juicy clear embossing ink, and then this time I'm going to use some detail white embossing powder. So I'm going to coat that with the embossing powder, and then I also have a piece of just yellow cardstock. I'm going to stamp the hay onto that with the same clear embossing ink, add that detail white embossing powder, and then now I can melt both of these with my heat tool. So the cardstock takes a few seconds longer, not very long because it's a small image. So melt that, and then with the vellum piece, vellum Anything heat embossed on vellum melts very, very quickly. You have to pay attention. You can easily warp and then burn vellum. So it literally takes seconds to melt embossing powder on vellum. So once I got that all melted, I used the coordinating dies from the set because they also die cut the words, which I love. So I'm going to die cut both of these with those coordinating dies. So just get those taped into place with scraps of washi tape. And then I can run these through my die cut machine so that both of them are die cut. And then to adhere these to my card, I'm going to use the tiniest bit of foam tape on just the ends of this word because it's so long it goes right over those flowers. So I just cut 2 little tiny strips of foam tape and I'm just putting that right behind the edge of the B and at the very end of the P there, just so that it's not like, you know, so it's a little bit bolstered up, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And then for the rest of the word, I'm just putting little tiny dabs of adhesive right behind the embossing so you don't see it through the vellum, because I don't like it when adhesive shows through vellum. It just doesn't look finished. So little tiny dabs of the adhesive, and I'm just going to press this into place right over that cluster of flowers and leaves. And then the little hay word, I just add the adhesive and I kind of tuck that right underneath the one bloom, just like so. So once I had that, while I was making these cards, I was like, what am I going to put on the inside? I could stamp. There's tons of sentiments. But rather than stamp sentiments, I decided to just take the floral images and I'm just inking them up with the same inks I used to do the faux watercolor effect and just inking up the stamps. So I'm inking up these buttercups with the sunflower ink and then the bottoms with the prickly pear ink and stamping them. They don't need to be perfect because it's the inside of the card, but you know, it just gives it a little something. So using kind of the edges of the ink pad so I can use, you know, 2 to 3 inks at the same time. With the leaves, I'm using both of those green inks and just stamping them pretty much in almost the same way I had them arranged on the front. So I'm going to go along, stamp those, and I do that to both of the cards I end up making. And then with the Spring Blossoms card, I'm going to do the exact same thing with those images, just using the violet ink instead of the yellow ink. So I'm just going to ink up the flowers with the purple, kind of stamp those in a bit of a cluster along the edge. And this time I didn't use every single flower in the set. I just used a few and inked up the ones that have any greenery. I just, you know, tap the stem and leaf areas into the green ink. Again, doesn't have to be perfect. Stamp those into place. And then I'll just ink up a few of the leaves and stamp those just to finish it all off. And that's going to finish off the inside of these cards. So once I have those stamped, I can now adhere the card fronts to the card bases. And then at this point, technically could be done. I always like to add bling. I literally had bling sitting here. I had some crystals and jewels and all that stuff that I was going to add. And then I thought about enamel dots. And then I thought about Nouveau drops. And you know, it's always a matter of what am I going to add? Rather than any of that, I actually pulled out, I was curious to see how this would work. I pulled out some Distress Oxide sprays. I wanted to add just some splatter because you gotta have splatter. So I decided to use the oxide sprays for my splatter. So for the Buttercup cards, I am using the fossilized amber oxide spray, shaking it up really well, and then I'm actually just taking a little bit of the spray and putting it onto an acrylic block. Just, you know, tapping the nozzle onto it just a couple times. And then I'm just using a brush and flicking that against the edge of the acrylic block to create my splatter and just splattering that right over this card front. So I do that with the yellow ones. And then for the purple, because the purple ink didn't really match any of the oxide sprays, I'm going to mix these two together. So I'm going to mix a little bit of Faded Jeans oxide spray on my acrylic block, just add a few little drops. And then I'm going to add a little bit of Wilted Violet to that. And it gets a very similar color to the violet ink that I used to color those flowers in. And then same thing, just use my brush against the acrylic block and splatter this card front, let it do its thing. These dried, I set them out aside to dry. They literally only took a couple minutes to dry, and that finished off these cards. So as always, there'll be a link below the video to the blog post. I'll have a supply list with links to all the supplies used. So if you are interested, you can check that out below. Thank you guys so much for watching and subscribing and thumbs upping and commenting on my videos. I really appreciate it. I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.